Thank you, everyone, for coming to this installment of the Chair's Lecture Series. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who I think is well known to all of us here, Colleen St. Clair. What can I say about Colleen and her history? Colleen is one of these returning Albertans, I believe. You are Albertan born and bred? No?
Well, I would have admitted that before the last election.
You are a native Albertan of some kind. I know at least you did your BSc here in zoology. Then you went away to do an MSc all the way to New Zealand, followed by a PhD in Oklahoma, and then homed back to Alberta for a little while as a postdoc, and then postdoced at Laval, and then had a little stint in BC, and then came back here as a faculty member in 1998. I believe. So that's 21 years of service.
Yeah.
Associate professor, and now, of course, you've been a full professor, I think, for close to a decade. So Colleen's going to talk to us today about her work, which in my mind, comes at the intersection of, I would say, animal behavior in a classic sense and conservation biology. And I think you refer to it as conservation behavior or behavior conservation? Conservation behavior?
Yeah.
Okay, with that, I'll hand over to Colleen, who's going to talk to us about her work.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming today. Wow, go all the way to the back. I want to say how much I enjoy these seminars. I've really enjoyed hearing what my colleagues do and learning how much diversity there is in our department. And I've also really enjoyed the opportunity to gather that these seminars have afforded, and the fact that they invite our profs emeriti, many of whom are here today, and many of whom have been really wonderful mentors to me. Partly because, as Dave acknowledged, I grew up here in Edmonton and did my undergraduate degree here. So I thought it might be fun to do what some others have done and give you a little bit of a chronology of how I came to the views that I'll express today, which will focus on this discipline, conservation behavior, and why I think that animal behavior makes a lot of important contributions to conservation, and how some parts of behavior in particular do that and might be undertapped. So by way of context, I did study in the Southern Hemisphere for my graduate degrees. I worked on very remote subantarctic islands, and there I studied a group of penguins known as the crested penguins. The best known example of them is probably rockhopper penguins. And these penguins have some very strange behavior. 3 species in this group have the peculiarity of laying 2 eggs, but then just before the second egg would be laid, in some of these species, the female actually ejects her own first laid egg from the nest. She picks it up in her bill and throws it, or she scrapes it out with her foot. And in 3 species, that's become invariant as a behavior. So that was a really early experience that showed to me how profoundly behavior can be integrated with adaptation. And I've remained really interested in that phenomenon, but by my postdoc years, I really wanted to do something that was more directly related to conservation biology, and I chose a popular topic in that era, 1990s, of studying ecological networks, and in particular, habitats that have been fragmented by anthropogenic development. And I wanted to do that using behavior, so I was interested in studying how animals move through these kinds of habitats in the kind of network that you're likely familiar with, of core areas of good habitat, matrices of lousy habitat, in between areas that might facilitate movement of individuals that are important to the viability of populations. And I was interested in the behavioral mechanisms of the how and the what and the where and the who of the individuals that did this moving and how they achieved it. So I'll tell you a couple of examples of how I and my first few students addressed these kinds of issues. We did so by choosing areas that were fragmented by anthropogenic development in some way, and one of those was the context of roads. So my very first student, Wayne MacDonald, looked at the way small mammals move across the Trans-Canada Highway in Banff National Park. And he tackled in particular the newly built overpasses, which had been designed as overpasses for grizzly bears, but with an umbrella expectation that the needs of grizzly bears were so grand they would satisfy the needs of all other species too. which really is kind of a silly proposition to compare mice and voles to grizzly bears. Nonetheless, Wayne did that, and he showed somewhat predictably that mice and voles do not prefer to cross roads after being translocated adjacent to them using these overpasses. They prefer to do it in these nice, secure little culverts. And that was true across these species that he studied. But what was more interesting to me than this rather predictable result was that some animals actually were capable, as these quintessential prey, of using these massive exposed overpasses, climbing over them as a way of getting home. So a lot of variation among species, and the same kind of variation was apparent in this study by Cam Gillis, who also studied habitat fragmentation, this time in the context of agricultural fields in the dry forests of Costa Rica. And what he did was also translocations of territorial individuals. He moved them in these treatments down riparian corridors, down fence rows, and across open fields to compare the rate and the success with which they could return to their homes, and he tracked their paths using repeated telemetry positions. And what he found was unexpected degrees of variation between two species that at that point had been believed to be quite similar in their forest needs. But he also found that this perception we have as people, that animals can see the structure of landscapes and use a corridor that's provided there for this animal between its capture and release locations quite strategically, but it absolutely failed to see it, despite being a bird with a bird's eye view. And eventually got home, but it took this very circuitous route. So these two studies, and many others like them, showed to me the fact that really you can't make the assumptions that we do tend to make about animals, and this homogeneity and this predictability of responses. And I was increasingly intrigued by the way animals find unexpected ways of solving these problems. And there's a lot of variation among species. There's no surprise in that, of course. One of my favorite ways of comparing this variation among species comes from work by McKinney, who's shown that in the context of birds and urban areas, you can sort of divide species into those that avoid urban areas, those that adapt to them, and those that actually go a step further and exploit people and their infrastructure in urban areas. And what I thought I saw in these fragmented habitat studies was a similar kind of continuum. And also, if animals did manage to adapt to a fragmented landscape, and they were also large or carnivorous, the next thing that would tend to happen is some form of human-wildlife conflict. So these are all species that we've studied in my lab various times in the context of conflict that arises because these animals are succeeding in using anthropogenic habitats that have been degraded and fragmented by people. So if they succeed in doing that, it's always because they have some degree of flexibility. And if you look at these species, they are all flexible species. They're what we would call generalists. And this distinction between generalists and specialists is well known in conservation biology. It's already well appreciated that the endangered ones are the specialists. They are the ones that only eat one thing, only in one place, only in one kind of habitat. And they're on their way to extinction as their world changes. The generalists are winning in this evolutionary era of the Anthropocene in the sense that they can eat lots of different things. They can live lots of places. They can handle interacting with people. But what's a little bit less appreciated from my vantage is that this same kind of variation around flexibility also occurs within species, within populations, among individuals. And that's almost entirely unappreciated by the discipline of conservation biology and wildlife management. So what do I mean by this behavioral flexibility? I mean something quite specific. I use a definition that's been provided by Coppens and others, which just means that it's the ability an individual has to respond directly, I couldn't split that infinitive, and adjust its behavior to the stimuli in its environment in real time. So this capacity to react immediately to the environment, change strategies behaviorally, is what's meant by flexibility. And it's been related by others to typical descriptions of personality or behavioral types in animals, kind of like this. More flexible animals are usually described as being the ones that are reactive rather than proactive in a coping style. Shy, rather than bold in tendency. Slow rather than fast in their exploration. I add, though, a caution, because as you'll see with our studies, these dichotomies don't really map very well onto the commodity of flexibility. And flexibility is where my focus is. So I think flexibility is so important because the way animals use flexibility to interact with their environment is often via learning. So if you think of those animals that I introduced earlier that are in conflict, you can think of them as just having been bad individuals. Or you can think that they were individuals that learned something about their environments during development, perhaps amplifying or suppressing some genetic tendency that they might have begun with as a temperament, perhaps amplifying some sort of developmental experience that might have been canalized in a short period of time, but nonetheless retaining this ongoing capacity for change. That's what I mean by this behavioral flexibility. And so managers could use this kind of flexibility. In fact, all of us could use this flexibility. Really, every animal that's ever been studied has demonstrated some capacity to learn. And, you know, even husbands can learn. It takes a lot of love and persistence. But even they can learn. And so managers might use this in a more proactive, directed way. Okay. What I'm going to try to convince you of in the rest of our time together is the possibility that behavioral flexibility should be viewed as a conservation commodity. A commodity that lets animals adapt to changing environments via learning, but has very important variation among individuals. If we could identify that variation and target it in a more purposeful way, we might have more ability to manipulate the expressions of flexible behavior in ways that could increase coexistence between wildlife and people, addressing this problem of human-wildlife conflict. So let me return to these three studies I alluded to at the beginning, one on urban coyotes, one on habituated elk, and one on a threatened population of grizzly bears, to show you what I mean by these parts of this statement. So I'll start first with just the flexible behavior and the various forms it takes using coyotes, already well known to you as a really flexible generalist species. This is part of the reason they've been able to expand their range over the last 150 years across North America, now inhabiting pretty much the entire continent, including pretty much every city on the continent. It was with this awareness that I began the Edmonton Urban Coyote Project about 10 years ago, because I had noticed that even here in Edmonton, there was increasing rates of reports of urban coyotes and aggressive behavior or interactions between people and coyotes that seemed to concern some people. And I was interested in what were the correlates of the things people considered to be conflict versus non-conflict. If we knew more about that, could we change it? And many others started similar projects at about the same time or a little more recently, because this problem of bold urban coyotes seems to be increasing everywhere. And in this venture, I was really capably helped by two wonderful people, Maureen Murray, a PhD student, and Bill Abercrombie, who donated his time as a professional trapper to catch the coyotes that were far too wily for us. So we fitted these coyotes with GPS collars, and we followed them around with a traditional study of habitat selection and movement, trying to figure out how they used cities and how they made use of anthropogenic resources. And something we noticed right away is that we captured a lot of coyotes that had mange. That's a skin parasite caused by the scabies mite that burrows into the skin. It causes intense itching, so intense that the animal basically scratches out its own fur, trying to relieve that itching to produce this characteristic sort of bald, mangy look. And we also noticed that these animals with mange had always been captured near large industrial compost sites like the one at the Valley Zoo and at South Campus. And when we started to look at the movement of these animals, we saw that their movement patterns differed dramatically around this commodity of disease. So the healthy coyotes had typical coyote-looking home ranges and some degree of territoriality, where they defended, or at least used in a fairly exclusive way, smallish areas concentrated in the river valley and ravine. The animals with mange did something completely different. They had huge home ranges, 10 times larger on average than these healthy coyotes, and they overlapped extensively. These animals were also much more active during the day and much more active in residential areas, all contributing to a sense the public might have about conflict by coyotes. And one of the things we most wondered about these urban coyotes is how do they manage to cross roads? That's what's assumed to inhibit the use of cities by a lot of other animals. So we thought by looking at these coyotes, we might learn something about how shyer animals might be inhibited from living in cities. And from this mange result, we thought, well, there's going to be something predictable here around disease status, or maybe age, or maybe sex or condition, or home range, but there weren't any of those correlations with road crossing behavior that we could find. Instead, what we found was a correlation with survival. So this graph shows several things simultaneously. It shows the coyotes collected by the city as roadkill. So that included some of our study animals. Oops, and that's these bars. And you can see right away that there's a big peak in roadkill of coyotes in spring and fall. This graph also shows the change in day length as a function of season. And as you know, day length changes much more rapidly at this time of year, a little earlier, around the equinoxes of spring and fall. And then it shows the meters per hour traveled by the coyotes during rush hour. And at our latitude, rush hour corresponds approximately with dawn and dusk in the spring and fall. And the coyotes that died maintained high rates of activity in crepuscular periods in spring and fall, when they were also overlapping with rush hour. And I think that contributed to this pattern of being more likely to die. The coyotes that survived, other work showed more plainly, became highly nocturnal in their activity. And that's a well-known strategy now, not just for coyotes, but many carnivores living with people in cities. They become highly nocturnal, a really nice example of flexibility. The flexibility that coyotes have to exploit a novel food source like compost might not turn out well for them. Or at least it might influence other aspects of their behavior that are relevant to conflict. So this graph is taken from stable isotope analysis results of hair samples that we obtained from coyotes that were not reported as being in conflict with people. So some of these were coyotes that were removed because of conflict behavior. And what we found is that the assimilated diets of these coyotes showed that the conflict-prone coyotes were eating less protein and more processed food, which was signaled by the increased turnover of carbon-13 signatures. So in other words, they were eating junk food diets consistent with things like compost. And we began to wonder what that actually does to them. So we looked at compost in more detail, collecting samples of compost and similar samples from places like fallen fruit, comparing the prevalence in them. Are you okay? You need a drink, you need something, that's okay. I just feel bad for you. Somebody give her a drink. We compared these compost sites to the fallen fruit sites using spectrophotometry to determine the presence of mycotoxins, the metabolites of fungi, as compost rots, which are known to be unhealthy things to eat. And we also visited compost sites and control sites in natural areas to collect scat samples from coyotes to look at their parasite burdens. And we found that the compost contained mycotoxins of two types that exceeded the federal standards for animal feed. The reason those standards exist is because ongoing exposure to mycotoxins degrades the immune system and makes animals more susceptible to disease, perhaps like mange. And also, those compost-associated scats had 10 times the prevalence of the intensity of parasite eggs in their scat samples. So, two reasons to think that eating compost and hanging out at compost sites is not so good for coyotes. And I wondered how this might contribute more directly to conflict with people. So in this era of the study, we've been studying coyote diet a little bit more directly by using coyotes that were provided to us as carcasses and looking at their stomach contents and trying to compare their recent diet with the characteristics of their microbiome. And I'm doing this in collaboration with Lisa Stein and Scott Sugden. And simultaneously, we've been trying to look at the parasites of these animals and others, using scat samples for that, to determine whether this diet might be changing the microbiome which might be contributing to more conflict behavior, either directly, that's been shown in humans and other species, or indirectly by increasing the susceptibility to disease, including parasites, that might also change coyote behavior. And we're especially interested in one parasite. You might have heard about it in the news over the last few years, Echinococcus multilocularis. This is one that Bill Samuel and John Holmes found in coyotes in Alberta decades ago. So what's the big deal? Might be one reaction. The big deal seems to be that this parasite that's being found more recently in Alberta seems to be a different strain, and it seems to be prevalent. So here's some of our initial results. This one led by my colleague Lean, who might be here somewhere. Lean led this write-up of this study looking at several different types of helminth parasites and finding that the prevalence of this one, Echinococcus, is really high in Edmonton's coyotes, actually higher than has been detected anywhere else. And just this last fall, there was another media story from the work being done, led by Alessandro Masolo, formerly at the University of Calgary, on how this parasite, and in particular a European strain of this parasite, is prevalent now in Alberta and is also infecting people. So it's a zoonotic parasite. And at last count, talking to the doctors that are working on this, there's been 14 cases of this parasite detected in people in Alberta, in Edmonton and Calgary hospitals. So what I'd like to figure out in future is whether this prevalence of this parasite, which is trophically transmitted and so engenders a hunting behavior, or logically does, is also associated with more aggressive behavior by coyotes. And just anecdotally, but interestingly, the coyote that killed the 110-pound Bernese mountain dog a couple of winters ago was positive for this parasite. So what does that mean about the variation among individuals? Here's a whole bunch of sources for it, but how might that translate into the way individual variation alters the way animals interact with people? I'll switch to elk to tell you more about how that might be studied and what might be generalized. So this study was led by Rob Found, another PhD student, on habituated elk in both Banff and Jasper. And you've probably seen these guys when you've visited those town sites. They're the ones that hang around in the town, munching on flowers and grass and grain on the railway, and sometimes acting quite aggressively towards people, which is one of the reasons that they are a management concern. So another thing that makes them a concern is that most of these aggressive animals have stopped exhibiting their historic migration each spring to higher elevations, which has a bunch of ecological implications. So we wanted to know what's the nature of the individual variation in behavior for these animals around flexibility, but in particular personality, and could that actually be studied in wild animals? So Rob did a bunch of dumpster diving to use a tried and true technique to assess personality, which is the response of animals to novel objects in their environment. And he made a lot of different novel objects. And then he put up remote cameras around these novel objects, and he measured the response of ear-tagged elk to these novel objects. And he saw quite a range of responses. So some animals were really shy, some were inquisitive, some were kind of aggressive, and some were quite playful around these novel objects. This was one of 7 different forms of assays he used to assess the personality of these individuals, and then he ranked them on a single continuum to describe them along approximately a bold, shy continuum. And what he found is that the bolder individuals, he defined those as the 50% most bold on this continuum, were more dominant to other elk. They were more likely to explore objects and to do it early. They were less often on the periphery of the herd, and they were less wary of people. They were also 3 times less likely to migrate. So these guys are disproportionately responsible for this ecological damage. So it's because of this ecological damage and the attacks on people that elk have long now been subjected to a technique known as aversive conditioning, one of the ways that the flexible behavior might be altered by learning. The idea here is to subject the animals to something they find unpleasant. So what we developed as a technique some years ago with my student Elsa B. Kloppers was to chase them while waving a threatening hockey stick in their general direction with a flag tied on the top, which elk find terrifying. What we think they do. And then to measure how wary they are towards people later by approaching them calmly and determining this flight response distance. And what you can see in this graph is the response of these animals and their flight response during conditioning. The shyer migrants actually had a smaller response than these bold residents. They got much more wary after conditioning. But the same relative difference occurred when conditioning ceased. So these bolder animals lost what they'd learned more rapidly as well. Another expression of saying they were more responsive to their environments. And by a year later, the conditioning change for these bold residents was gone. There was no effect of conditioning whatsoever. And we think this capacity to learn and unlearn is really central to this idea of flexibility. And it might have to do with the way the brain is wired. Rob studied that by looking at this phenomenon of lateralization in the elk. And he measured it with their handedness, or really hoofedness, in the way they crater in snow looking for food. Animals that use the same hand over and over are said to be more lateralized. And what you can see here is that more lateralized individuals were the shyer migrants, suggesting that one of the things that makes these animals more able to exploit these novel townside environments is actual cerebral flexibility. They have less dedication to routines that would be a competitive advantage if their environment was constant, but perhaps a disadvantage if it slows their rate of learning. So we synthesized all this recently to say that humans have been doing a whole bunch of things in the environments of these animals that favor these bolder personalities that result ultimately in a higher tendency to remain resident in town sites where they can handle interactions with people. They can eat different types of anthropogenic forage. They can avoid interacting with their predators by using humans as a predator shield. And they can succeed in outcompeting other elk in contests. So that's one way that this behavior might be manipulated, but I'd like to tell you about another way, another direction that flexible behavior might be manipulated. The flexibility of animals might be suppressed, like I was describing in elk, or it might be increased if it seems that lacking flexibility is the problem. So how might that work? I'll tell you about that in the context of grizzly bears in a large collaborative project that I did over several years with Canadian Pacific and Parks Canada, with several collaborators and several graduate students. And this project came about because in Banff, particularly also Yoho National Park, where the CP rail main line travels, there has been a sudden onset of grizzly bear mortality. Since the year 2000, 17 bears have been struck on this rail, and in many cases confirmed to have died, and in some cases just suspected to have died. And in the 20 years before that, almost 20 years of record keeping on the same railway line, there was not a single case of a grizzly bear being struck by trains. So this created a huge hue and cry by some members of the public in the Banff and Canmore communities, who created the impetus for this project to occur by demanding that something be done and generating the funding that made the research possible. The same public interest also kind of came to a predetermined opinion on what was causing the problem. They decided it was grain being spilled from rail cars, and that if only the railway could be made to clean up the grain, this problem would disappear. I had my doubts about that from the beginning, because the railway has been sharing this park with grizzly bears since 1885. Well, we tried to look very comprehensively at all of the things that attract bears to the railway, and we found that indeed grain does attract them. There's about 110 estimated 110 tons spilled a year. That's enough to feed 50 grizzly bears all of their calories for an entire year, if they were to find and eat it all. But also abundant along the railway are all kinds of other foods. Vegetation in the form of invasive species that bears like to eat, but also native species that are, buffalo berry has been referred to as the salmon of the Rockies. It's a perfectly natural and very important food source, but it likes the rail because there's more light and heat there. So there's more of it near the rail. And then squirrels, these terrible creatures that some people actually study. Cache grain all winter long. from the rail. They hide it in their middens, as these enterprising animals do, and then the bears come along in the spring and dig it up and eat it all. What an injustice. Ungulates get struck by the rail, and that might be the thing that some bears, large ones in particular, really target. And then all of the bears seem to use the rail as a way of moving between areas that are otherwise hard to traverse. And we didn't find evidence that grain was the sort of be-all and end-all explanation of what attracted bears, nor did we find that attractants were what caused the mortality. This figure shows the locations as a heat map where bears concentrated their movements and use of the rail. So these are continual movements where they stepped along the rail continuously, and just overall general greater use of the rail, those red locations. And these diamonds are the locations where bears have been struck by trains, grizzly bears. And you can see that actually there's not much use in this major hotspot of mortality down here. And in fact, the only association we found in comparing different types of steps was a negative one. Bears, the GPS-colored bears that continued along the rail, those sites were negatively associated with past sites of mortality. It's hard to know, though, how representative the few, relatively few, examples of grizzly bear mortality are. So we wanted to understand a little more comprehensively what could predict the vulnerability to mortality for animals generally along this rail. And we looked at many different factors. These models are divided into 3 guilds of bears, carnivores, and ungulates, increasing sample size by using black bears as well as grizzlies, all of the other carnivores tossed together in a group, and all of the ungulates for which there was a very precise location available that could be compared to available sites. And then we put these models through 3 different spatial scales to identify the most robust predictors. And the top one was curvature. Animals are more likely to die where the rail track curves. That's not surprising to anybody who's ever been on a railway and been surprised by a train. It's hard to see them or hear them coming around corners. And we also found that movement was related, as our a priori predictions, to several of the factors that appeared in these top models, places where the movement of bears might be constrained in the surrounding habitat. So this contributed to an impression we actually already had, that bears might be limited in their ability to detect trains at the locations where they are struck. And this is the reason that Jonathan Bax, an interdisciplinary PhD student, set about to invent a warning device for bears and other wildlife that attaches to the webbing of the rail with rare earth magnets and works exactly like the kind of warning device you're already familiar with that we use at crossing structures, crossing locations on railways for people. So you know if you cross the LRT line that when a train is coming, you're going to hear a bell and see a light flash. And the exact same thing happens with this warning system 30 seconds before a train arrives, and only 30 seconds before a train arrives. So it satisfies some of these learning principles that we would be expecting to allow animals to learn robustly. And if you wanted to see this thing in operation, you could watch this little short mini documentary that CBC did on it, where they have some really amazing footage that those magical camera people can do, right from ground level with the railway and the warning device going off and a train coming and so on. So recently I've synthesized all of our work on the bear project to say that if you look back in time and consider some records and some circumstances that I won't trouble you with, but there's quite a lot of them, and consider why it is that bears might be on the railway at all, a lot of things have changed in their environment that required learning that would have increased the tendency for that behavior overall, not only at specific locations. And we think that this problem of being surprised by trains happens really quite rarely from the tests of the warning devices. But of course, the consequences are catastrophic. So that's why I've encouraged a view of railway mitigation that is based more on these rare event passages of a train, already rare relative to cars on roads, and even rarer events of detection failure. So I think this kind of mitigation using a warning device might be quite effective for railways, and it might be much more cost effective than trying to replicate the mitigation that's used for roads, fences, and crossing structures. So finishing, I'll say how, I guess I've been saying how I think this emphasis on understanding the sources of behavioral flexibility could contribute to more coexistence with wildlife in a variety of contexts, not only where wildlife are in situations of human-wildlife conflict, but also where our activities might threaten wildlife. And what I think we're trying to aim for as a society in a goal of coexistence with wildlife is sort of this sweet spot in the middle of McKinney's categorization. We don't want animals that avoid human infrastructure altogether because it's pretty close to everywhere. But we don't want animals to be exploiting it too much either because that definitely leads to conflict. We really want to encourage animals to have this nice, polite, adaptive behavior where they can share space with people but then, give way when the people are there. So how do we make animals more likely to exhibit this adaptive rather than exploitive or avoiding behavior? I think we could do it with more attention to the principles of learning and the mechanisms of learning that are well known in other disciplines, particularly in learning theory developed by psychologists, mostly for rats, but also for children. And we can try to teach animals in a more dedicated and systematic way which things are or are not profitable for them. So I've acknowledged already one example of how this could be done with aversive conditioning that we used in elk. And I'll return to that now to say that aversive conditioning, or hazing as it's often known, is a technique that's being advocated quite widely now for dealing with this explosion, well, not literally, just an increase, of urban coyotes. And the U.S. Humane Society is suggesting that aversive conditioning or hazing could be a way of teaching these coyotes more wariness. I agree in principle, but I have begun to worry that the particular approach to hazing that the Humane Society advocates, which is mostly just shouting at coyotes, might backfire. It might actually set in place a process of habituation rather than sensitization. You're nodding as if, no kidding, it's going to do that. It's sort of like you keep telling your kid, do that one more time, and I'm gonna do something bad. But you never actually do anything bad. So one of the principles of learning, advocated by learning theorists that specialize in punishment, which is kind of a black thing to specialize in, but such people exist, is to obey these principles of punishment. And I won't go over all of them, but one that I think is really important that has been more or less disobeyed by wildlife managers is the importance of high initial intensity in a punishment. So think of the time your parent, or you as a parent, witnessed a child about to run into a road and consider their freak out reaction that resulted. That's an example of high initial intensity. But it's also very effective. Children learn really quickly not to do that again. The punishment seems way out of step with the infraction, but it changes the behavior quickly. And I think the same thing needs to be used with aversive conditioning. So that's what I've been advocating for several years now to coyote managers in Edmonton and Calgary. And to my great surprise, they've started doing it. So they've hired Bill and his crew to go out with a very well-trained dog to places where coyotes have been reported repeatedly as being very bold and aggressive towards people. The dog's job is to bring the coyotes out, go and engage the coyotes and bring them out into the open so that Bill can shoot them with a chalkball gun. And that might seem kind of harsh, so much so that actually there's been a backlash to it in Calgary by a kind of distant colleague at the University of Calgary who has a very different view of what humane treatment of animals should be. And from the comments on these two articles, an Edmonton article quite favorable towards this philosophy and approach, this Calgary article quite critical of it, from the comments that result, it's easy to see that society has a very divided opinion on this issue as well. So time will tell how this turns out. I hope that people will have the stomach to not spare the rod and not spoil the coyote, because I think that would increase coexistence in urban areas over the long term. So I'll finish with an upbeat message. In case you were despondent about members of your family or your own study organisms and their capacity to learn, remember, everybody can learn. So thanks very much for your attention.
Great job, Colleen.
the water bottle.
That's a surprise.
Oh, boy. I feel like I should
You don't get it yet.
pour
You
this.
have to answer questions first.
Okay.
I'm sure there will be some questions.
Yes, I'm happy to answer questions. And I should have actually said, I really appreciate the folks that have funded these studies and contributed to them over the years. Lisa.
I have a question about the penguin study.
Oh, okay. I'll try to remember
So
it.
the picture that you showed had like a big egg and a little egg.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if what you found was that it allows them to select like what they think is the more robust offspring. Is that the reason?
Yeah, that's exactly the reasoning. I just thought it would take too long to explain. So super briefly, they have a quirky evolutionary past that produces this massive egg dimorphism, and their first laid egg is much smaller than their second laid egg, unique among birds. So I reasoned that once they had this in place, when they moved from being inshore foraging penguins to offshore foraging penguins, they didn't have time to raise 2 chicks. But moreover, they had trouble even incubating 2 eggs in these really hostile environments that I showed but didn't describe. So it's great that you're interested because it was pretty hard to follow. My idea was that it is so expensive to even try to incubate those eggs that as soon as the female realizes she's about to lay another egg, and I feel certain they can feel that sort of thing happening, she gets rid of what could have been an insurance egg in case she didn't lay 2 eggs. Maybe 10% of them only lay 1 egg, the really young ones. So this behavioral solution is like a behavioral route to a single egg clutch that keeps the big egg, the good one. That would have been too many words, though, right at the beginning, don't you think? Phil.
I know, right?
I wanted to provide an example of how sarcoptic mange in coyotes causes some inflexibility responses.
Please do.
I handled mangy coyotes several times, and I got mange. Jeez. And my wife.
That's why the profs emeriti don't always get invited.
And the inflexible response was my wife made me sleep on the couch.
Aww. Well, it was probably effective for learning. Well, my similar story is that I had my son shoot me with a paintball to determine how much that does hurt, because you don't want to recommend that treatment to animals until you know. And it took my breath away. It was so painful. But I thought, it was just a fluke. He hit me right on one of those knobs of your spine. So I had him do it again, and I was wearing JC's big leather jacket. Like how much, that would be similar to a bear hide, right? Again, it took my breath away. It really hurts. But I think that's probably a good thing. At least it's not dead.
When you
Aaron.
went up with the grizzly bears, you showed that most of the deaths were at Banff.
Mm-hmm.
The use is near Louise. Is it possible that all the bears in Banff are dead? And that's why that's the use.
That's such a great, really astute question of something to notice, Aaron. It's true. Most of the mortalities have been in the east end of the park. And most of the use, the higher proportion of use has been in the west end, where the terrain is more rugged and the railway is more of a travel advantage. I'm among friends, so I will just tell you this. Maybe the most important thing I discovered in this study is that Parks Canada had a carcass pit right here. And so there was this massive public outcry about this grain, and I've actually taken a lot of flack from a troll, I guess they're called, about the fact that I questioned the importance of grain, knowing about this much bigger food source right beside the hotspot of mortality. So I think you're quite right that the Banff and Lake Louise town sites, where the other mortality hotspot is, are kind of sinks for bears. And there's a whole bunch of things that contribute to that. These sort of super attractants are one of them. But another thing I did in a synthesis paper was go back in the mortality records and just stack up what bears have died from over the past 40 years. And 97% of the management-caused mortalities occurred in the 17 years before the onset of train-caused mortalities. 86% of the mortalities associated with transportation occurred after the onset of train-caused mortalities. And the total increase in mortality was about 15%. In other words, I think it's been mainly compensatory. So it's a good idea, or it's a good example, I think, of why the public should fund universities to do these studies, because otherwise you might
Good try.
Preaching to the choir.
Yeah. Kim and then Warren, yeah.
A question about the aversive conditioning in the elk. You present it as the change from their baseline behavior, but do their baseline behaviors not differ a lot in how they respond? Like, by definition, your bold and shy
The bold and
differ,
shy already differed.
right? So don't they, the bold ones just have more
Yeah.
skill to adjust?
We got that very question in review, and we had an answer to it that I can't now remember.
But it was a good one.
I'm sure it was a good one. At least it was enough of one. I will find out and get back to you. Yeah, great question. Warren?
Yeah, so Colleen, I just wondered if the habitat fractionation, is that causing any problems with the animals themselves? I mean, we talked about human-animal interactions, but when you disrupt these populations by cutting them off, are there problems between different animals?
Oh, for sure. Like at a population level, this problem of habitat fragmentation is well known to cause a bunch of problems. It subdivides populations, it lessens their genetic variation, it increases their susceptibility to all of the problems of low genetic variation, but also to stochastic environmental events, stochastic demography. All those kinds of things contribute to the theory of why in reserve design or ecological networks, fragmentation effects should be avoided, barriers should be avoided. And maybe I went a little too quickly and a little too glibly through the series of studies we did on this, because it was quite a lot. And we did find evidence to support that view that yes, animals are impeded in their ability to move through these fragmented habitats. But what I was far more struck by in all of those studies is actually how good at figuring out how to do it many animals are. And then how unjust it seems that when they do figure that out, the next thing that happens is often some kind of conflict. So that was the fuller description of that. But quite right, fragmentation is bad for populations. Maybe not quite as bad as was believed in the 90s when it was like really bad. And now I think we realize actually habitat loss is much worse than habitat fragmentation. Abby.
Really wonderful work. I love the behavior part of this.
Thanks.
In your migration work that you've done with the elk, though, I know you brought in lateralization, okay, so that's a component of this, but I'm trying to get my head around whether migration makes an animal bold or bold animals migrate. And is there any way to tease that apart?
I don't know. That's such a good question, and it's part of why we wanted to look at the lateralization results. But even in the expression of the behavior we see, we can't know how much of that came from a genetic predisposition, how much from some sort of developmental process, how much from the experience the animal lived in its environment. The reason we're all supposed to do crossword puzzles, right, or whatever it is we're supposed to do, I've forgotten, is Sudoku. I'm going to do whatever Kim says, she knows about these things, is to retain the flexibility of our brains, making our brains think in these unexpected ways. The reason you should spend some time patting your head and rubbing your tummy is because it makes your brain cross those hemispheres. So we can't actually really separate which is the chicken and which is the egg. I hope I'm getting at what you're asking. I've kind of concluded that for the coyotes too, we can't really say, do the sick animals go to the crappy food, or does the crappy food make the animals sick? In both cases, I would say it doesn't really matter. Once you've entered the cycle, you're in a positive feedback loop. If you eat crappy food, you're going to get sicker. If you're sick eating crappy food, you're going to get sicker still. And similarly, if these elk are gaining from these flexible behaviors that let them have high payoff from human use areas because they are able to overcome some inhibitions that we would call bold, they're going to get bolder still. So that's the point that I was making, is that there's this positive feedback loop occurring quite inadvertently on the way we're managing many protected areas that are making ungulates bolder and bolder and more able to benefit from residency.
I'm just wondering, Colleen, if we know anything about how heritable that flexibility is, the bold versus shy.
Yeah, Kim would know a lot more about this literature than I do. Like, mostly what I have contributed, I suppose one thing I've contributed is to point out that these darn elk don't even fit maybe this is the best one to show it with, they don't even fit the personality literature properly, the bold elk should be more lateralized, not less lateralized, according to the theory of the temperament of proactive coping styles that would make animals both bold and routine dedicated. So I don't know. I don't know if you want to add anything, Kim, but I don't know how much of it is genetic. Oh, well, Chris, that's awesome. That's what these seminars are for.
It's a long time ago, so I didn't really follow up, but wild-type populations of larvae. So the way you can grow these larvae is that you put a blob of yeast in the middle of a plate. And there are studies showing that in a normal population, the sitters, I think they're called the rovers, is that sitters and rovers?
Oh, I remember hearing about sitters and rovers.
So behavioral traits as a polymorphism, genetically speaking, in the genome, where you already have a split in the behavior. The sitters don't move away from the food, they stay there and keep eating, and the others are more exploratory and adventurous or bold, if you wish, and go beyond that plate and even crawl out and try to find other food sources. It's not overpopulation or anything. And later, I believe, do you know, I think they found gene markers that were associated with the sitters, and I can probably dig it up.
That's...
But it's the one thing we talk about in behavioral ecology as like, there are 3 examples of like behaviors that are one gene that explains it all, and this is one of them.
The sitter versus
So guaranteed this is
rover.
not going to be, yeah, Drosophila wasps, there's like the hygienic behavior, it's 2 genes. And then there's like one other one where it's like 1 or 2 genes. This is going to have heritability somewhere between 0 and 0.3. Probably closer to 0.
Closer to 0.
Put more covariates in.
Yeah.
It's that crazy. Andy?
Yeah,
thank you,
In
Chris.
the bigger picture, where I grew up in northern Canada, when I was a kid, there were lots of animals that we never saw. In other words, bears, we never saw a bear. Certainly not mountain lions, they're there now. But you could go right through the animal kingdom. You could look at mink, you could look at fisher, you could look at marten. Now, and foxes especially, now they're absolutely common. They have no fear of humans. And of course, you end up with lots of roadkill because whatever that behavior is, has changed. And I've often wondered, what is it that's happened in the last 40 years that has resulted in this massive change in behavior?
Well, a lot of people attribute it to the decline in hunting. And I think you have yourself, Andy, in previous conversations. And if you saw John Svensson's, for those who did see John Svensson's talk last week in the ecology series, talking about brown bears from Sweden, they're tremendously shy around people, and 10% of them are harvested each year. So they're all really used to not trusting people. And that's what I'm advocating for this hazing. We need to teach coyotes not to trust people, which is why I'm sometimes to be found sneaking up on the coyotes in Park Allen Park, and then running at them and throwing tennis balls with flagging tape at them. And I would shoot them if the city would let me, but. Mark, were you?
Well, hunters, of course, shoot bulls at it. And
a great point, there's an interaction there.
On bulls, we had 100% of our bull elk killed by hunters. But
that's right.
But wolves.
In Simone stuff.
Wolves are much more likely to get shy elk. So you've got sort of balance between hunting and wolf predation. May actually be helping to maintain the variability in the population.
That's an intriguing angle. The wolves are more likely to get the shy elk. Is that because they're more likely to migrate?
Well,
they're going farther into the wolf.
Okay, so we have very good data on the age specificity of mortality caused by wolves. And young elk and old elk are much more vulnerable to wolves. The elk learn to become more shy over time, and by the time an elk is 7, 8, 9 years old, it's almost bulletproof. When they become very shy, they learn very well how to avoid hunters. But those are exactly the elk that are most likely to be killed by wolves.
Perhaps then partly because they are avoiding people as their proxy, not just hunters, and wolves also are avoiding people. So they necessarily correlate? Do you think it could be partly that? Interesting, thanks. Observation.
Oh, sorry.
Stan, oh no, you're going to say something about squirrels.
And he set me up
ready.
to get the population dig in. His view that this was all a behavioral issue could easily be explained by the fact that the densities of all these animals have gone way up because we haven't been poisoning the shit out of them for 50 years. Suddenly all of these guys are up in numbers, and it has nothing to do with a behavioral change.
Oh well, touche. I'm going to say it's a great example, actually, what you just pointed out of what Steve Herrero has called the role that tolerance has for boldness in animals. And he's pointed out that in Alaska brown bears, on the salmon streams where there's really high densities of animals, because the food resource is high enough to support that, they completely lose their territorial behavior, which is well known that territoriality is dependent on resource concentration. Those bears that are really tolerant of each other have a much higher tolerance of people, or capacity to habituate to people. You see how it's all about behavior.
Let's take one
All
more.
about just so stories.
I realize that you're getting a little long in the tooth and you're raising. But it's all about behavior.
I thought I saw one more.
Jockeying for.
I'll ask a question later on.
All right, that's
Thanks,
fantastic,
everybody.
Colleen. Thanks very much. Before I bestow upon you your honor, I'd like to let everybody know that the next chair's lecture is Thursday, December 12th, and Ted Allison will be talking. And then finally, I'd like to present you with one of these highly coveted Department of Biological Sciences Inspired Discovery for a Better World water bottles.
Thank you.
You have to hurry. So thanks.
I will enjoy it.
Great.